Welcome everyone to a deck hockey focused special presentation, the 50-year history of organized street, deck, and ball hockey.
Tonight in part 4, we explore the 2000s, the rise of ball hockey. Scott, what can we look forward to?
In this episode, we're going to cover the 2000s, which is really the birth of the sport of ball hockey in the United States. Obviously, there was pockets and areas that were playing it, and it was played heavily in Canada and on the world stage. But deck hockey had really been the predominant variation of our game up until this point. And the 2000s saw a little bit of a recession in the deck hockey world. And then along comes Jamie Cooke, who's going to be one of our main speakers in this episode, started cool hockey events and really started the ball hockey tournament circuit in the States. We also are going to see the revival of the women's game, and Alessandra Glista is going to give us a firsthand perspective of the women's game and its revival from where it was when we last saw it in the 80s, and it took a little bit of a dip since then, and it's going to take a big jump forward in the 2000s, in addition with the help of Jamie Cooke as well. And then we have a lot of great players and influencers who played both deck hockey and ball hockey. Too many to name and go over right now, but one of the big ones, obviously Bobby Hauser, son of Chris Hauser, who grew up watching all the deck hockey greats and grew into his own as one of the greatest deck and ball hockey players there are. So tune in and listen, but I think we've got a good one for you guys.
The new millennium brings a decade of change to the sport. Jamie Cooke walks us through.
What a lot of people don't know, in the early 90s, after playing in the late 70s through the 80s, in the early 90s, around 94, I stopped playing. I actually moved to the beach and did the beach thing, and I didn't touch a stick, and when I left, the tournaments I was playing in, you'd have so many good teams. I mean, you would go to a tournament and there was no divisions. It was open. I mean, it was all A teams. You'd have 20, 30, 40 teams. Every single team was great. Every player was great. Every game was a battle. I mean, the play-in games were like the final. I mean, it was incredible. Teams hated each other. Players hated each other. I mean, when you got off the rink, you couldn't even make eye contact. I mean, it was that intense back then. It was a much different culture than now. Pros and cons for both ways. I kind of miss the old days where it was that intense. That I understand we needed to move away from that to grow the sport. And that's part of the history of the sport and how we got into the 90s and 2000 or into the 2000s. So, after my beach stint, I came back up and started playing again. And the first tournament I went to, I was really disappointed. It was like 4 teams. It was in New Jersey, maybe 4 teams in an upper division and 4 teams in a lower division. The hockey was terrible. I didn't think too highly of the event. It was just a bad experience. So, I decided I'd run a tournament in the DC area. I partnered with DC Street Hockey, Wayne Barrett. We ran a co-ed tournament, and then we also ran a men's tournament, and we got a lot of compliments of how the tournament went. Wayne Barrett and we co-founded DC Street Hockey, and then he kind of moved over to run that, and then I kept doing the tournaments, and that's when we started Cool Hockey Events. And for Cool Hockey Events, the true founder of the sport to me is Mr. Leclerc, who started all this, and then he really passed it on to Chris Hauser and Mark Madden, who kept things going through the good times and the bad times. But they really did a good job in the Boston area with Chris, and then of course Pittsburgh with Mark, and then you got Jay Meacham kind of in between trying to do some tournaments here and there, and some other guys doing some small stuff. But we really needed to revive the sport, a different approach. So when I came back, I kind of looked at what Chris and Mark were doing. I even visited some some roller hockey tournaments. I looked at other sports, how they ran tournaments. And I really felt like to get teams to come down from Canada and to start crossing state lines and to get the team count up where teams could play and actually leave with their dignity, because they were coming and playing against open teams and getting killed, the new teams. So we kind of needed a way to bring those players in so they could develop. That I started trying to look at the business model of making tournaments in fun places, So I partnered with Turk and Caicos Islands, a guy out there, to run a tournament, and we draw 2 U.S. teams. And I did that to try to open up internationally to get U.S. teams out there and to get international teams coming our way. Tampa Bay started up with Matt Gary down there, which was a good destination. Terry Cox out in Las Vegas did a great job for that tournament for years. And that was, again, a great location. George Tarantino, more of a transitional or a traditional tournament in Harrisburg, but that was a good central location to bring the best 8 teams together. So that was a good fit. And then, of course, you had Jay Meacham doing his thing here and there in Jersey and other places. And then I also partnered with a guy named Brian Broley, who's incredible up in Canada with Barry Ball Hockey. And we came to a backroom handshake that he would send teams to US and I would send teams up there, or we'd facilitate that. And to this day, that still occurs. And that was very productive. So now we got teams coming from Canada, teams from the States going to Canada. We got teams going all over the place. And we also have divisions that allow new players to come into the sport at a lower level. They can play, keep their dignity, get better, and then lo and behold, teams can play in the upper divisions, and it just was great for the sport. We also had the co-ed division, which was new, and we had the women's division. And I think all that did, it changed the culture where it was no more, the intensity definitely dropped, but not the level of hockey. And then along with that, lo and behold, I brought in ball hockey. And what really made me bring in ball hockey wasn't because I like ball hockey better than deck hockey. I played both, and I'll get into that some, but I love both all the time, all kinds of hockey. But ball hockey, I was really inspired because I saw our U.S. national team struggle internationally when I was watching and I was involved. And I really thought that was because we always played deck hockey. And the floating blue line's different. The bigger rink's different. It's a different strategy. It's like softball and baseball. Is it the same skill sets? Yes, but it's a different sport, really. And you have to play a different strategy. And, Mark Madden's freshman team that won gold really was inspirational to me. And I wanted all the teams to advance and do well internationally. So I felt like, well, what's the better way than actually play it? To be able to play the Slovaks and the Czechs and the Canadians, we got to play their game, not just when we go to Worlds, we got to play it consistently and also, keep playing deck as well. So that's how North American Championships came, to be. And, and the other thing that people don't understand is like, I was one of the people that played both growing up. I was very fortunate that we had a place called Woodhaven, and they had full contact ball hockey on a huge ice rink that was on cement. And wow, talk about intense, and I'd also go up to Canada and play with some travel teams and play true ball hockey. But then I played deck hockey at Family Fun Spot in Aston, formerly Tinicum in Haverford, which was one of the first deck rinks in the whole country. And I also played South Jersey ball hockey, which was ball hockey, but on asphalt, a little smaller rink. So I kind of played it all, including on the streets of Leadham Estates, which is a small town outside of Philadelphia. The old days where you have to move the net when the cars come in, and you're using cars as your dasher boards, which was pretty cool. So to me, hockey's hockey. I loved it all. My intention with ball hockey was never to diminish deck hockey. It was kind of like just to put another form of hockey out there to help grow the sport. And then here we are, we're in the 90s, which is now, or into the 2000s. In the 90s, like we talked about, there were so many good teams, so many good players. You guys could pick 80 teams and every team would be incredible. I mean, it was just really unbelievable how teams. Now in the 2000s, there weren't as many teams because we were going through that growth phase. But what I thought made the 2000s special was it was bipolar. You had some deck hockey teams, you had ball hockey teams, very high level. You had the Gamblers early 2000s, you had Gods, you had very fast ball hockey teams. Then you had these structured killing machines like the Stars and Team Pittsburgh on the deck hockey side. And then they're on this ball hockey rink playing, and just seeing the different strategies, I thought through the 2000s was incredible. And in the later 2000s, we just saw so many good teams start to develop. And I think the late 2000s were right back to where we were in the 90s. And it took that growth period. And, it was a really team effort from a lot of different people to get us to that end of 2000s. And lo and behold, if we look at the sport right now, I think we're in a real good place. I mean, is there still room for improvement? Absolutely. But, I haven't been involved in a long time, probably, 2016. So I mean, me being an outsider looking in now, I'm so proud of where the sport's gone and where it's going to go. I mean, there's just so many cool things going on right now. But just if we just put it in perspective for the year 2000 to 2010, wow, incredible some of the games, especially North American Championships. And I will note, I did play as a player up at the Can-Ams, and it was probably one of my top 2-3 experiences during that time to go up there and play again because of the energy of that deck hockey event that Chris runs. And we went up there with the mixed team and we ended up losing the quarters. I loved it. It was incredible. I mean, just something about that rink, the hair goes up on the back of your neck, So, 2000s, I think, was a great decade, but for a lot of different reasons than the 90s and the 80s, and the 2000 to 2020 when we analyze that. So very cool.
In the early 2000s, the game was still alive, but was facing a recession. It was time for a new generation of leaders to take the reins.
I think it was I think it was numerous things. I think it was definitely roller hockey had an impact. I also think that we really didn't have any national strategic plan, or we weren't looking at it holistically. And, because it was still prospering in the Boston area for the most part and at the Pittsburgh area, but everywhere else it was just dying and it was going bad fast. And some of it was, back in the day, you had your league and tournaments actually motivated guys to compete and play more and be on the tournament team and go travel. But then what I noticed when I came back was they teams would just be, you'd have 6, maybe 3 or 4 very good teams and everyone else was set back, and those teams would just come and get absolutely humiliated. And a lot of these guys were trying to go to sports, so they're new players. So now do they want to come back to the second tournament? No. So we had to figure out, well, how do we bring the new players in and let them leave with their dignity, but still let the good players compete and get better? And that was a challenge in the beginning. But I think somewhere in the late 90s, we lost our way with that. But then we right-sized it. And in roller, deck hockey, roller's dying now. So I think people came back. That was just a fad.
So correct me if I'm getting this straight, but pre kind of 2000s, there weren't a lot of these, say, BC novice, rec divisions. It was, you went in and you either got beat 15-0 and, went home, or you didn't participate if you were starting out.
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much. And I have mixed feelings like that. I would love to go back to the 80s where, you just go to a tournament. But the timing wasn't right for that. There wasn't enough A teams. Now there is. They can have an A tournament like a Harrisburg, just A on that weekend and get enough teams. In the early 2000s, you just couldn't do that. And when we first tried to grow it with guys just getting humiliated, it just wasn't allowing us to grow it. So we had to go into the different rec and co-ed and novice and every other division that's been come up with since to make it more appeasable for guys to come in. But you look at some of these teams now that are moving up, a lot of those teams were the rec teams, and guys they played in their league, they got better and better, and then they could play in the A or the B tournaments. Now what I tried to do is I would come and just like everything, 50% of people like it, 50% hate it. I always liked playing into your division, because then guys can't bring a loaded team and say, yeah, we're a C team, and they kill everybody. I always liked having an A, B. You play against each other. The teams that have the most points move on. The other teams go down, and then if they did take a beating on Saturday, they'll leave with their dignity on Sunday because they played against teams there in their skill level. So there's no perfect format out there. I'm just happy where the sport's gone, and it's been really a group effort from a lot of different people that are still doing it now. Like, I sit back now, I'm not involved at all. I just love to think, like what we're doing today, the different things people are doing now. It's just great for the sport. And I'm sure if Chris was on here, or Mark, or even Ray was still alive, everyone would be proud where the sport's grown. It's no one's vision. It's just kind of evolved organically to where we're at today. So it's cool to watch.
I think you're being a little bit humble there, Jamie. I think as someone that had the opportunity to play against some of the great teams in the 90s, when I was still extremely young, getting asked to go with the Sabres or the Force, I think we underestimate the impact of roller hockey on our sport. I think some of you may know I had the pleasure of playing Major League roller hockey, right? So I played professional roller hockey for a short period of time. And it still, in my mind, was never as good as ice hockey or ball hockey. But what it did do, while I don't think it impacted us, it impacted those freshman kids, right? Because instead of having to go on an ice rink or worrying about a pond freezing, with the advent of, and you guys will all chuckle, but we still call them rollerblades, but rollerblades was a specific brand of inline skate. Right now, everyone calls them rollerblades. But kids could be out front instead of playing street hockey. They were playing roller hockey out front of their house, right? Just by being able to be on blades. So a lot of those freshmen, which is ironic, because now if you look at the Masters teams, and you're able to, you're allowed to have 3 37-year-olds. Well, I can tell you the U.S. has a hard time finding 37-year-olds because there was a lull when kids were just all playing roller hockey, right? There was no ball hockey. And what I think that had impacted on our generation in the 2000s was it was kind of what Cillo and Tommy alluded to was those teams, those power teams from the 90s, and there were a lot of great ones in the rivalries. Those guys started getting older, right? And they started having families, and hockey really, didn't. So those of us that were kind of on the cusp of being freshmen or just breaking into playing in the men's leagues, we had nowhere to go. So I can contribute. The Mid-Atlantic Shock was in my mind. And Tommy even played was at the end, was that as good as that was for some of us, it was to what Jamie's point about, because teams couldn't field all guys because people had started dropping off, you had to start forming super teams, right? So it was a bunch of Long Island guys, a bunch of Jersey guys, some Boston guys, and then you would play and go to tournaments. And, we obviously wanted to pick all the best guys. So what did that do, though? It diluted down, a Jersey having a team, or Long Island having a team, or Boston having a team. So it definitely thinned the pool in regards to the good A teams that you played. And I have to give, Bobby some credit. He's one of the few that I can remember, building a team and bringing them to the A, and maybe, having at least being true to his region and coming and saying, hey, I'm just bringing my guys, whether we're going to get our asses kicked or not. And they were always competitive, but I knew he knew enough people to put the best team he wanted to on the rink. But instead, he was true to his form and said, I'm just bringing guys from my area, from my whatever. And the good news is I'm starting to see that, right? I had the pleasure of doing that a little bit with the Supreme. It was a bunch of Jersey guys, good, bad, or indifferent. We could never be coached correctly. But then they evolved that, right? Then when the Gamblers and Supreme didn't fold, that team kind of collapsed. And there were enough young Jersey kids that said, you know what, we're good enough if we put teams together. And I think they had a tryout with 50 guys and now have 2 teams, right? So if you look at the U.S. hockey circuit, whether it be deck hockey or ball hockey, we kind of have returned to that team format from the 90s, where there are very few teams that are a combination of players from all over. You may have 1 or 2 guys, but you got the Stars, right? I'm sorry, you got the Saints, you got Bobby's team that travels. You still have the Gods now from Pittsburgh. You have the Warriors from New Jersey, right? So we're starting to build those regional teams, and as a result, you're starting to see that the rivalries that I think existed in the 90s that kind of didn't in the 2000s start to come back, which in my opinion is nothing but good for the sport, because you need rivalry to make it competitive.
Y2K had come and gone, and so had the deck hockey of the 90s, which was rapidly being replaced with the 5-on-5 ball hockey game we see today.
the transition was kind of by default. I mean, obviously Jamie, you know, starting that, and we would go to support. I think for some of us, you know, the Long Island guys, didn't really have a choice. Really, we traveled so much, and once the tournament started to navigate, you know, towards ball hockey, and you know, Bobby, you know, I didn't know he was going to be here, so it's a pleasant surprise. But you know, fortunately for me, you know, someone like Bobby would go to a lot of tournaments as they started to grow up, and you know, if you wanted to go, there wasn't really many tournaments to play. The deck hockey ones were kind of, you know, a couple in Leominster, maybe a couple other ones along the way. So it was more by default, and I don't think we really, after the North Americans, as far as a group, the Long Island guys, I don't think we adjusted very well. That's why we didn't really have many teams later on in the years, you know. So, but
well, and Sil, I think you were one of the ones to first be exposed, you know, from back in the day, you know, Quorum being as lead as they were. You know, if you don't mind me sharing a memory, I can remember, to Jamie's point, we had a team called Mayfair, and they were very well known in our area, and they were behemoths of men. I mean, if you looked at them top to bottom, they were gigantic. They could move the ball, but they played ball hockey. And as Jamie said, they were used to playing full contact. So, you know, as you talk about the teams in the 90s and the competitiveness, Quorum being one of the nastiest teams, came down and played them in their rink. And, you know, Sil, I'll defer to you, but as I remember it, because I traveled there, because it was, you know, it was about a 45-minute ride, but it was very well known in the circuit in and around where we were. The Mayfair did a pretty good number on Quorum, right? I mean, it was close at first, and then I think at the end, you know, it wasn't, you know, 5-1, 7-2, something like that. I don't remember the exact score, but it was kind of pretty obvious that the difference in game made a difference to Quorum. So then Quorum said, okay, we came and kind of tested you. You know, why don't you come and play deck? So I remember it being freezing because there were trash cans that they had started bonfires on, and Quorum had come to Aston, Pennsylvania, and Mayfair came, and it was in the winter. And I'm telling you, it felt like it felt like an NHL game with as many people that were crowded around the rink or whatever. And Quorum beat them up pretty bad. You know what I mean? And again, it was Mayfair's inability to adjust to the deck hockey game. They did play in a few tournaments that some of you may remember, but they never fared as well as what I believe is truly a team that they were, because they just could not make the adjustment from ball hockey to deck hockey.
And I think that's a great story. And I remember things years ago better than I do yesterday at my age. But that ball hockey game, what's interesting is Quorum, that game was very tight. The reason Mayfair won was all power plays.
Yep.
Every goal was a power play because they had the big rink and they had set plays, and that's how they beat them. And that's really how the Canadians beat us now too, when they do beat us. So, yeah, that's a pretty cool story. I remember that.
yeah, I was gonna when you said Mayfair, that's the first thing I thought of, because that was brutal. Like Frankie and Louie, a couple of those guys were like towards the tail end of their playing anyway. And I think by the time, was it in the finals that we played them? I don't know if it was in the finals that we played them, but I don't think we made it to the finals, but whenever we had like guys sitting we had like 3-4 guys out by the time we got to like whatever our last game was. It was pretty rough. And I don't know, you know, obviously that was the first version of any ball hockey. And, you know, I don't think it's the same as that version, you know, with Mayfair clubbing the crap out of people. But it was definitely something that the Quorum guys were not able to adjust to, that's for sure. Right soon, really wasn't much further after that a lot of them didn't play anymore.
Now, Tommy, what is your remembrance of going to the first couple North Americans, you know, and differences as opposed to, you know, maybe the deck hockey tournaments that were around that time, or even what North Americans looks like today?
Well, you know, I was lucky enough to start out in the early 90s with some of the Seahawks guys. So I got to see a lot of the greats from the 80s and early 90s. I played deck hockey for a good 15, 16 years before I ever even set foot on a ball hockey court. We formed the Stars in the late 90s, and I'd say most of our primes were probably late 90s to the mid to late 2000s. It seemed to me that the ball hockey came in, I think it was 06 was the first North Americans. At that point, I was 35 years old. We were probably the best team in the country at that point. We walked in, we won the tournament, and I thought it was a pretty easy transition. But eventually, some of our guys started having kids and getting older, retiring. I think Cillo won the next two North Americans, so they had some success as well, but then their guys started falling off. I think the biggest thing was age and some of the Canadian teams coming down. Like Mike and Jamie were saying, like they play a different style. We'd go in the box, they'd score some goals. By the late 2000, like 8, 9, 10, I think we started to decline a little bit. But one great memory I have, and Cillo was there, was the 2011 Harrisburg. We were all 40 years old. The Stars had fallen apart. Long Island fell apart. Pittsburgh fell apart. So we took 5 Stars, 5 Long Island guys, 5 Pittsburgh guys, and we're all 40, and we won the one Harrisburg, which I thought was a pretty good accomplishment. 40-year-old, big rink like that. So we proved that we could adjust to it. I think we just kind of caught it at the tail end of our careers. We've all gone on to play Masters tournaments, and we've had some success, but we still have a little bit of trouble with the Canadian teams. And I think one of the things with our generation is we're all 50 years old and we're still playing. So a lot of guys have seen us play for 10, 15 years, but it wasn't even our prime. It's kind of late in our careers, but we're still playing A tournaments, and thanks to Jamie, we're still playing Masters tournaments. So I think it's a different generation. You don't see a lot of the guys from the 70s and 80s who played until 50 years old, except maybe Chris.
Bobby, you want to jump in? Obviously, you have a little bit of a unique perspective. You grew up at the rink, and you obviously saw all these guys playing, and then eventually towards the tail end of this decade, obviously jumped on and started playing against them. What was that transition like? What do you kind of remember as a kid growing up watching these guys and then eventually transitioning and playing with them and against them?
I loved, obviously I'm the son of Chris Hauser, so I was always at the rink, and it was like my favorite time of the year was these tournaments. And when I first started playing, I think 2004, I formed my own team, and I was getting killed by everybody for being Hauser's son. The Rams didn't like me. The New Jersey River Rats, I think that was a team, they didn't like me. And I was just a kid. I wasn't good until maybe 2006, so I was getting fucking shit kicked out of me. Oh, I just swore shit. I was getting beat up bad, and then I eventually played on the Rams, and my favorite matches were probably against the Stars. So I remember watching them a lot. That's when I was really focused on hockey, was Greater Boston Stars. Leominster Elite was really good for a while, and the Rams. And there was a couple craziest game, or one of the craziest games. Tommy, I think it was against you guys, when Carrillo turned around off a face-off because he was talking to a fan.
Yeah.
That was Elite.
Ball back and scored. Was that against you?
No, it was against the Stars Elite, right? I believe.
I think so. It was a playoff game.
Yes, because James had just switched over to the Stars, and the Elite beat them on that, or tied them, or whatever it was, on that Carrillo arguing with a fan. Well.
But it was awesome just being able to play with. Against everyone who I watched those tournaments religiously, and I was the only kid that was a Rams fan, me and 3 other people. And then when I finally was, I think 2007, was my first tournament on the Rams. It was fun. I think 2007 and 2010 were probably my favorite years of playing. Now I lose all the time, so it's not as fun.
With the U.S. transition to ball hockey, success had begun on the international level. In 2006, the U.S. juniors took home gold, and in 2009, a highly dominant Canadian team was upset on an international stage.
Yeah, the tournament was in Italy. It was a super dope setup, but it was Italy, so there wasn't a lot of fans, but it was I think there was 8 teams in it, and the top 4 went to the A, and the entire A division all tied each other in the craziest ways you can imagine. I think I remember we tied Czech Republic with a second left. we tied Canada with a minute left, and we blew a lead against Slovakia with like 20 seconds. And the tiebreaker was goals for at the time, so we got into the gold medal against Slovakia. And I think we won that game 3 or 4-2. And I think it was good because it was the first, wasn't only the first gold medal, but it was just the first medal in general, because USA has been coming in fourth for the past 4 or 5 years. And just winning that, I thought put like, like now we're like, hey, like, USA can actually play the sport. So I think at the time, like the worldwide view of us was like, oh, they're good, they're just not that great sort of thing. And then 2009 was probably the next big one, which is that's still part of the 2000s. And we knocked off Canada. And probably I think, my opinion, I thought that was a bigger upset than winning the gold medal.
That week was very special. The thing that stood out to me right away was the chemistry of the team. There was no one who was about themselves in that locker room. The leaders were Eric Schultz and Bill Allen, Kobe Sweat, very selfless kind of guys. So we supported the younger players. And, it was like the coming out for Bobby, Denny, Hildo. Those guys really stood out that tournament. And the team was built properly for a big rink. So we were maybe the fastest team in the tournament, and it really paid dividends in the Canada win. I knew then that there was probably a gold medal in the U.S. If the team was built properly that week. So for me, it will always be special. Got to know Tyson that week really well. I'd never met him before. So we became real good friends after that. So many good things happened that week for our country in general. And obviously the results on the rink. Steve Gregory scores in overtime, and I feel like I'm floating for a month. It was unbelievable. And we actually came really close to winning that tournament. We were up on India 4-2. India was really good. We were up on them 4-2 also. Let that game slip away. It was kind of a young team loss. But that's how close it was. That was a semifinal game. And if we win that game, we're in the gold medal game. And I honestly don't think we would have lost that gold medal game just based on momentum. Chris Hauser did an outstanding job of coaching that team. I can't say enough about him. That was a big week for our country, in my opinion. For all those reasons I just stated.
And just to kind of clarify for those who don't know, and Bobby touched on it, so maybe we can edit it in a little bit. But if I remember correctly, Canada was either coming off of or they had won like 2 or 3 of the last 4 or 5 world championships. So they were a powerhouse, and you guys actually were in the B division, right? And had to play your way into the A playoffs. Yeah. So to even make it more of an underdog, like you guys weren't even let in to give people an idea who see it now. The U.S. wasn't even allowed in the A pool of the World Championships. They had to play their way in. And then here you are, obviously playing a team that, was probably a favorite to win the entire tournament. Canada's always a powerhouse in any type of hockey, you can think of. And then, obviously, like you mentioned, Gregory, sends you guys obviously past them, and makes people believe that obviously you guys can win at a world championship.
Yeah. I remember when that tournament started, they had the opening ceremony. So we go up and sit in the stands. They threw us out of the stands and told us we had to go sit in another part of the rink because it was only for the A pool teams. And boy, when we made it to the A pool and beat Canada, I remember talking to some guys and pointing to the spot in the stands. I'm like, I wonder if they'll let us over there now. Like, it was just, it was magic. It was a magical week. One of those times where everything just comes together. Everyone on the team was together. I can't say enough about that. It was such a great time.
As the East Coast transitions to ball hockey and teams jockey for position, a decades-old deck hockey rivalry was still alive and well in Massachusetts.
Well, for me, I mean, when I started out there, like I said, I started with the Seahawks, and they kind of had a rivalry with the Rams, but they were getting older at that time. So I learned that, the Rams were the team to beat. If you're going to go to Leominster, and we always considered the Nationals to be the biggest tournament, maybe Can-Am's was second. But that's what we shot for. I mean, we grew up in Boston, so those are our big tournaments. And, back then, there were other teams. I mean, I always felt like there were 8 or 10 teams that could win. I'm talking late 90s, early 2000s. But it always ended up seeming to be the Stars and the Rams in the semis or finals for a big game. I know that for us, we had to get over the hump. I mean, I spent a lot of the 90s losing to the Rams, and we lost a lot to Cillo and Long Island in the late 90s as well. When we finally won, I think it was 99 was our first Nationals. I think we believed that we could do it. And then we went on a little run for about 5 or 6 years. We went to maybe 30 tournaments and won, 20 of them. And we were probably in the finals for every other one that we didn't win. It took us beating them to believe that we could actually win. And it's something, I think it's a learned thing. And to speak to Mike's point, and going back to the roller hockey thing a little bit, I felt like, there were always 8 or 10 teams in the late 90s, early 2000s that could win these tournaments. There were the Lunatics, the Force, Long Island, Pittsburgh, Raiders, Rams, even Elite was pretty good, Stars. But I think the lull happened maybe in the mid 2000s, and we had a little bit of a gap behind us. That's one of the reasons we're still playing Masters is there's no one 37 or 40 or 42. That was the roller hockey gap right there. It did start to die, and Jamie did reinvent it with the cool hockey events. But those late 90s, early 2000s, I think was kind of like a glory day of the sport. Bobby was there watching a lot of these games, and I think every single game we had with the Rams was a 1 or 2 goal game in either direction. And they were like a measuring stick for us.
A lot of penalties, a lot of fights in those games that I watched back when hockey was hockey.
Yeah, I remember as the Stars games were always great. I mean, I go back. I mean, I started playing with the Leominster Saints in the 90s, and we had the rivalry at the Rams, and then we pretty much all ended up on the Rams not long after that. And then playing against the Stars and playing against the shot was with the Dreamers first. I mean, I go back to that with the Dreamers and Coram. And then the Stars games were always great. And always, like Tommy said, 1-goal games. And you never knew who was going to win. It was always 1 or 2 plays that made a difference in those games. And I think for a lot of teams, the measuring stick was the Rams. It was for the Saints. We didn't win a tournament until we beat them. We had to beat the Rams to win a tournament. That's propelled us. Once we beat them, we started winning tournaments. So I think that's always been the case. Now it's the gods. I mean, I laugh because some of the gods guys I see on social media, they get all upset when people don't like them. They're like, oh, everybody doesn't like us. You shouldn't you don't want people.
Right.
I love the fact that to this day, there are still people who hate me because I play on the Rams, or hate the Rams because we beat them in some tournament in 1993. Stratty, I mean, he every time I see him, he's got some story about how we beat him in this, and it still eats him up 20 years later. I mean, that's great. I love that. And I try telling those guys, like, you got to love it, embrace it. It's the best thing about it is that people hate you enough where they want to beat you. Like, they care enough about that you're that good that they don't like you. I mean, I'm sure Cillo went through that in the late 90s when they won, I don't know, 8 or 9 tournaments in a row, or pretty close to it. People don't like you, and that's okay. I mean, that's part of competitive sports, and I think that's an important part of coming back. And I think Mike hit that on the head. It's starting to come back again. And I think that was a great part of the Rams-Saints rivalry in the 90s, and the Rams-Stars rivalries in the 2000s were great too, because I think there was a lot of I don't know if it's hatred, but there was a lot of anger on the rink during those games, and a lot of emotion. And at the time, you don't like the guy, but I've grown to become good friends with a lot of those guys on those Stars teams that I played with them and played against them and got to know them over the last 30 years or so. So I think those rivalries were incredibly important to the sport, and they kept it going because people came to those games. I mean, there were still tons of people up in the stands for those games between the Rams and the Stars and Elite and those other teams that he mentioned as well.
In the early years, the women's game was nothing but successful, but in the 2000s, it was on life support.
I talked about in the other podcast discussion about the 2000s, and I brought up how I did that the co-ed tournament, and co-ed in DC is actually huge, and it was big when I got here. That's all they had, so that's pretty much what I played in. And then there was a league down in Virginia for men's I would go down to, which was DC street hockey. So when I had that tournament, the women came to me that were playing it, and they actually were ladies that were playing in the Philly area, and they said, Jamie, if you're going to run tournaments, can you promise to run women's tournaments? And I said, yes, I absolutely will. Okay. So at the time, there was only 3 women's teams in the whole country, and they would still play. You had to give them credit. They kept it alive. There was a team in Boston, a team in Long Island, New York, and then a team at Philly, Jersey area. And that was it. And they were good. They had 3 good teams and they played. And what we did was I started thinking about, well, how can I do this? I don't have many teams. I got to create excitement. So I started reaching out to the International Ball Hockey Federation. And I said, listen, why don't we do this? Why don't we do some kind of Canada-US challenge? I'll run the tournament. It could be like in Buffalo or Niagara or somewhere. And we'll have these 3 US teams play 3 of your teams. Well, what happened was they came back and said, well, Jamie, we're going to have the men's World Championships in Pittsburgh. Would you run the women's World Cup, the first one in Pittsburgh? And I said, oh, absolutely. So then it started growing. So we brought these 3 US teams, and actually Philly combined with New York, and then Boston brought their team down. And then we threw together a team from DC, along with a goalie from California and I think a couple of Pittsburgh players. Lisa Bach actually was on the team. She carried the team. And then we played, it was great. So Switzerland showed up, Czech Republic showed up, Canada brought 3 teams, Slovak, and I think Austria. So we had the first Women's World Cup, and it was absolutely an emotional experience, a lot of tears, a lot of things going on. And then, we obviously started running tournaments at North Americans with the women's division. You got to give the girls credit because back then they wanted to combine the best talent that they want to play with each other, right? But they knew to keep this growing, they're going to have to bring teams that are organically from their area. They can't build super teams, and that's what they did. And they stuck with the plan. And then because we had this partnership with Brian Broly up in Canada, he would be sending women's team down, which gave us the international team, which made it exciting. So we had 1 or 2 or 3 Canada teams coming down, and the ladies stuck to the plan to form as many teams as they could. And I think we had 9 women's teams the first year, and they played into an A and a B, and then it kept growing. I mean, and Jason Kelly and JJ Devaney have done a great job with the women. Your event up north holds the women's event, I think, sometimes, and it's just grown. And and I left the women's, actually the plaque above me is from the 2007 team. So I was the general manager for that team. And I knew the national program would create excitement. So we had tryouts, and camps, and it allowed women to have something, to have a goal and where they didn't in the past. And I think that was a big part of the growth as well. But really, it always comes down to people getting involved. And on the women's side, wow, I mean, I had so much help from Rich and Lisa Wagner to, Alessandra, and then Jason Kelly getting involved. And I mean, Gina up in Long Island, and Mary up in Boston, and, so many people, and the dedication and the sacrifice that they made to try to grow that women's division to get it to where it is today, which is a pretty cool place. Now they're building the super teams because they can, is really more of an emotional thing for me than the men's side. I love both, but the women's was something I never really planned to got into, but it really filled my heart with where it went and where it's still going, and it's funny, I watch the World Games, and I don't even know the players now personally, but so I'm more like a fan, and I'm watching on the stream, and I'm just probably their biggest fan, and they don't even know it, but it's really heartwarming where Jason took it, and now where Alessandra and others are taking it, and the women are the men could learn from the women right now. I think the women are I love all of our U.S. teams, and I think they're all good, but the women have really stepped it up, and they're they're a major force in their division now. And when they walk on that rink, I think Canada and Slovakia and the Czech Republic are very concerned about the U.S. program and how good they are. And they should be, because there's some really good players. So, and there were synergies between the co-ed and the women's. The co-ed is kind of like allows the women to get into the sport, kind of like the lower divisions with the men. And then they get into the travel hockey on the women's side. So that was kind of the same thing, but a little bit different business model. So, the shape of the women's sport, so happy where it's at. I do hope we continue to have equity between the men's and women's programs and how they're supported. And I think it is happening in the US and other places. And I hope that continues, and we'll see where the sport goes. But the women's sport is unbelievable. Totally stoked where it's at.
Alessandra Glista gives us a firsthand insight into the status of the women's game in the 2000s.
Yeah, so there really wasn't too much out there. I remember starting out as a kid, I played on boys like youth teams. So I started really late in my career for some people, I guess. So, early teens, and I was a soccer player and then kind of a soccer goalie and then transitioned to ball hockey goalie. But there really wasn't much out there. So we started, I started in cadets and I played with the boys. And then, from there, I kind of, there was opportunities at Hockeytown in Saugus, Massachusetts, for co-ed. And so without that opportunity, I don't know if I would have continued to play, but because there was co-ed, I got to play with a ton of really great people, especially up here in, the Northeast with tournament players and things like that. As it evolved, I started playing with tournament guys. So a lot of the Stars players played up where I played. And so I kind of evolved as a goalie and, filled in wherever I could, which was all men's leagues here. And so from there, there were such great players, honestly, especially back in the early 2000s, I would say is the prime for me, at least, getting to play with those men. And then I learned about some opportunities as far as, women's tournament. I know that, Cool Hockey has been really great about creating opportunities, I guess. I kind of switched to roller hockey for a little bit because there were a lot of opportunities to play in tournaments for roller hockey, and some opportunities to play with women in roller hockey, which I didn't really have with deck hockey. And so, yeah, we found out about a tournament that Cool Hockey was putting together in conjunction with also finding out that there would be potentially a Team USA for the first time officially going to Germany. So that kind of got me back into ball hockey. I had kind of started with ball hockey, transitioned to ice hockey and roller hockey, and then kind of came back in the early 2000s with the ball hockey and the opportunities that were there as far as tournaments go. And it was super small back then too. I think maybe there were 4 teams, one from Boston, which I actually ironically didn't play with them because they were already established. So I ended up filling in and kind of competing with the DC team at the time. So that was my breakthrough, was being part of this DC team and getting to meet all these new girls. And I think there was probably a team from New York there. And so, yeah, it was pretty small, and a team from Philly there as well. So it was pretty small back then. And then, it started to evolve. I mean, I don't want to get too far into the future here, but nowadays there's 2 to 3 divisions at, these Cool Hockey events and other women's events that are run. So it's kind of cool that it's evolved from the 4 teams to something bigger than that. But yeah, I would say a lot of the times that I played, it would be with the men's teams, and because of that, and because I think they took me under their wing and I had really good coaches, I was able to kind of excel with the men, which I'm really grateful for, obviously. But yeah, that was kind of that early 2000s, where things were. I think what was happening, especially with the women's circuit, was that we did attend the tournaments, as many as we could actually. Many of the girls, I would say it was very raw in the beginning. So 2007 was the first women's Team USA, and we were just a bunch of different athletes from all over the place, but really varying skill levels. Like we had, field hockey players that really never ever played ball hockey before. And we were kind of coming from all these different areas and competing actually internationally. So we had very new raw talent, super passionate, but really good coaches. Gwen Lemieux was one of the first coaches for Team USA. And she was really instrumental along with Jamie Cooke. They had kind of put together that first real opportunity for us to play internationally, but also for the first time, I feel organize the women's game. So we kind of were always ragtag, try to put different teams together. But for the first time, I think they were trying to implement structure, which I think is super important. To kind of get the exposure, get the baseline coaching, because I feel even nowadays, women are coming from all different sports, which is the great thing about ball hockey, right? You don't have to be an ice hockey player and then transition. You can be, but you could be a soccer player. You could be really any kind of athlete. And I think that the thing that was missing for a long time was just the structure. These girls weren't really coached, and they really love the sport and they love the community, which is really awesome. I think that's why people stay in the sport for so long, is because of that community. But I think that Jamie Cooke and Gwen and those and the coaching staff there just started to put structure to the game, which was awesome. And I think that started to bring more people in and bring more interest in, and Jason Kelly with the tournaments and having them grow as well.
The late 2000s saw the establishment of the major A tournaments we know today, the North Americans and the Super Bowl bye week in Harrisburg. George Tarantino walks us through.
A local rink that I was playing at asked me if I could run a tournament. They knew that I traveled around and knew a lot of people. So I did have a tournament one year. I started with just a lower division thing. And then after that happened, I really had a desire to throw another A at that time of the year. I realized the week before the Super Bowl was wide open and no one does anything. So I decided to try and host my own major A. And Harrisburg, I got to say, doesn't exist without Jamie Cooke the way it is now, because he's the one who convinced a couple of the top real A teams to come to the tournament. And the first major A I had was really, really good. So it's been great since then.
As a new generation of leaders emerge in the sport, it's not without the help and guidance from the founding fathers.
I was lucky. I could pick up the phone and I had a mentor. Chris Hauser would pick up and talk to me. Mark Madden would talk to me. Jay was very supportive. A guy by the name of Wayne Weaver was a mentor. I mean, I had a lot of support. Sometimes in the public, some of us would argue, and I think people thought that we didn't get along, but that was never the case. Chris and Mark and Jay were highly supportive of what I was doing, even though the vision was different than what was going on. So I don't think people ever understood that what was going behind the scenes. There was a lot of talk between Chris and I, even people up in Canada. So the support mechanism for me to do what I wanted to try to do was there. It was certainly not just me. And if I didn't have that support, listen, if the old guard, like Cillo did always tease me, he was very good at that. If the old guard didn't—
You made it too easy.
If the old guard didn't jump on board with what we were trying to do, it would never have happened. Because in that transition, I would have the new players, I wouldn't have the old players. I still would be, at the end of the day, the same number of players. So, I just want to be real clear with that who was involved behind the scenes, because I don't think those guys get credit for what they did in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but they were a part of the 2000s success too.
And that concludes part 4 of the 50 years of organized street hockey, the 2000s, the rebirth of ball hockey. Scott, what does the next decade bring us?
Well, ball hockey is in full swing with teams, tourneys, and locations completely committed to the sport. We see our men's and women's teams compete for medals at the highest level possible on the international stage. The women's game continues to grow, and with the help of a newly formed USA Ball Hockey organization, we see growth across our entire country.